Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to my channel. I am Monet and you're watching Life is Monet. And today we're going to talk about 10 of the most surprising reads of 2021. I do want to mention that not all of the books in this video were 5-star reads for me. Some of them were, but these were mostly just books that took me completely by surprise by either how much I enjoyed them, how good the writing was, how good the plot was, or the characters was. It's just whatever I was expecting going into these books, they exceeded my expectations greatly and probably have been living rent-free in my head ever since. First up, we have Falling by TJ Newman. This is actually a debut release by this author that came out in the year of 2021, and I was in my half price books and I walked in and I just seen the cover and I looked, and just something about the cover and like the plane falling, I was just like, okay, like this is very interesting. So I remember picking it up and I read the inside flap and it says, "You just boarded a flight to New York. There are 143 other passengers on board. What you don't know is that 30 minutes before the flight, your pilot's family was kidnapped. And for his family to live, everyone on your plane must die. The only way the family will survive is if the pilot follows his orders and crashes the plane. Enjoy the night." So I immediately knew that this was going to be a thriller about a hijacked plane. And I remember putting it back on the shelf and I was just like, okay, I've never read a book like that, and this was at a time like before I was really reading thrillers throughout the year. But then I seen it at Target, and then I seen it at Barnes & Nobles, and then I seen it on Instagram because I seen the author do kind of like a promo for it. And the author of this book is actually a flight attendant, and she actually wrote this book while doing her job as a flight attendant. And then me and Chanel from Chanel Time started doing buddy reads on thrillers throughout this year, and the audio for this one actually came out on Libro as an ARC when it first released. So I was just like, okay, like I keep seeing this book everywhere. Let me just give it a try and see if this is the kind of thriller that I like. This book was so gripping and like fast paced, especially with like how short it was. And there were so many like pump faking moments that me and Chanel was just like, I cannot believe this is happening. I did not expect when we read this book to literally feel like this was happening to us. I remember like literally gripping the book as I was reading it, and I text Chanel because I actually started reading this physically while she was listening to audio, and I text Chanel and I'm like, is it just me, or like am I actually nervous about what's gonna happen in this freaking book? Like I'm literally invested in this pilot by the name of Bill and his wife and his kids being held hostage by these hijackers. And then the pilot Bill, you get to follow not only him and his wife and children who have been taken by the hijackers, but Bill actually needs to still fly the plane, and someone on the plane is working with the hijackers who are back on land, and he has no idea whether it is an employee or if it is another passenger who is working with the hijackers. And it's pretty much just this anonymous person on the plane that is going to make sure that the plane goes down, but Bill still has to fly the plane, and so he's not able to really scour the plane and look at the passengers to see who may be a suspect, and so he has to depend on his flight attendants. And just the camaraderie between them and how they dealt with every situation, I was immensely proud of them. But I also remember like giggling a little bit because one of the flight attendants literally had like a nervous breakdown where she just started like pouring cups and snacks and stuff, and like they're like, someone just hijacked this freaking plane and they're trying to poison us with gas and you're pouring drinks. Do you know that that's not actually our job? Like we pour drinks and give out snacks as a courtesy, but we're really here for the safety of the people. Just every reaction in this book felt very realistic, and I remember thinking like, I wonder which one of these characters I would end up being. And Monty actually read this book and I believe he gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It is a very short read, a very short thrill, but it is indeed a thrill, and I was very surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. But I would definitely be reading any new book that TJ Newman puts out, and this is definitely going on a top read of the year for me. Sticking with the thrillers that basically blew my mind this year, next up is going to be The 22 Murders of Madison May. Now I read the synopsis of this one and it really gave away nothing. Prior to the release of this book, I had seen this author write 2 other books that were pretty popular, but I never got a chance to pick them up, and I seen this one at Barnes & Nobles, and I'm a sucker for really good covers, and this one just totally sucked me in. It was the color and the words, but more so it was the woman that was kind of running, and it just gave me sci-fi vibes. And I remember picking this one up and I was just like, I don't know, like the synopsis sounds very weird. I don't think that the synopsis of this book does it any justice. But this is another book that me and Chanel decided to buddy read, and we were just blown away by like the actual murder scenes in this book. In this book, there is a character by the name of Madison May who we don't actually follow, but she is a character that drives the plot forward in terms of like what happens in this book. There's a younger kid who sees her in one reality in a film, and he becomes obsessed with her, and he's determined to like meet her and just be with her, but it doesn't actually work out for him when he meets her because he kind of comes across as like this crazed fan. However, this kid has the ability to jump timelines, and so he decides to do that and pursue Madison May again, except you have no control over the timeline or the alternate universe that you actually jump into. And so whenever he jumped into an alternate universe, he would come across Madison May, but it would not be his Madison May. Sometimes she would be a teacher, sometimes she would be a waitress, sometimes she would be an understudy. So like every different universe just played out a different version of her life, and he becomes so enraged with her not being the right version of herself, and he's also very like infatuated and obsessed with her, that he just comes to the point of like breaking down and losing control, and he ends up murdering her. And he murders her multiple times across multiple timelines. We do have a separate character by the name of Felicity, who is actually a reporter, and she is put on the investigation team for one of the murders that occurs for Madison May. Then she gets caught up in the time jumping scandal because one thing leads to another, and so she's trying to track the kid down to stop him from murdering Madison May, but also trying to figure out where she is supposed to exist in this new universe, because it is her life, but it's not actually her life. What surprised me the most about this book was how thrilling the chapters where we got to see Madison get murdered was, because you don't actually know who is going to be the killer in this timeline. So you follow Madison throughout her day as she interacts with different people, and everyone kind of seems like a suspect at one point, because you're like, is it gonna be him? Is this person gonna be him? And so you're on the edge of your seat trying to figure out which of these characters that she's interacting with is going to end up being the kid and actually murders her. I was actually really surprised by the way the world was set up. It was very sci-fi. Like, having a thriller sci-fi was a combination that I never knew I needed, and this is definitely one of my more favorite thrillers after Falling, because it was just such a fun time. This is another very short read, and it made me definitely want to check out the other books that this author has written. The writing style in this book definitely made visualizing what was happening so much easier, and it honestly reminded me so much of what I loved about Marie Lu's writing. And with writing Warcross, Marie Lu was really good at conveying the graphics and like the design of the game, because she's actually a game designer, and that's one of the things that she went to school with. And Max Berry, I believe, actually works in tech. I remember reading it on the back of the book. He is a developer for an online game simulation, and he works for the tech giant HP. Between him and Marie Lu, I've learned that whenever I see an author who's actually worked in any type of like game designing, web designing, or like tech related things, whenever they write a book that is very sci-fi based, I'm going to always grab it, because it has not failed me yet. Warcross was a fun time. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This was also a really fun time. I also gave this one 5 out of 5 stars, but I was not expecting this book to be as good as it was, especially because I looked at the ratings for 3 books by this author and they were all low. And I'm very shocked, because this book was so freaking good, and it makes me definitely want to read the other ones despite the low rating, because maybe people aren't appreciating him. Book number 3 is another thriller as well, and that is going to be For Your Own Good by Samantha Downing. Now, this was definitely hyped up as a thriller, and so when I read it, I was expecting a thriller. And usually when I expect a book to be one way and I start reading it and it's not, it tends to be more of like a letdown or a disappointment for me. This one was not a thriller at all. It was really just like a mystery kind of, but it was more of like a humor parody kind of book. I was actually very surprised by that, because I've never read a parody or like comedy book, but this year I read 2, For Your Own Good, and I read the Finlay Donovan book, but this one was just so much more fun for me. In this book, we're following this teacher by the name of Teddy, and he is pretty much like, he has high standards for his students, and whenever they don't live up to his standards, not just in the classroom, but all the way around, how they act, their characters, being honorable, being respectable, being on time, when they don't live up to those standards, Teddy feels the need to punish them. And sometimes that can go as far as poisoning a couple people, murdering a couple people, and also poisoning a couple co-workers that get on his nerves. Teddy is someone who just wishes that everyone would act accordingly and people would get out of his way and just let him do his job. While this book was not a thriller, one drastic thing just kept happening after another, and I was genuinely amused, like actually highly entertained with what was happening in this book. I found it very funny how overzealous all the character was. Teddy was. Every character in this book is so devout in like their purpose and what they're doing that they actually become so overzealous that it becomes a parody or like a caricature of the roles that they're actually playing. This book definitely made me more open to reading more humor and like comedy type books, which is actually how I ended up reading Finlay Donovan. And while I did enjoy that book, it was more of a 3-star read for me. I enjoyed this one so much more because I just could not believe how far everyone in the book was willing to go. Like, there's another student that we follow, and there's a really cool dynamic between Teddy and the student because Teddy doesn't like suck-ups and like straight-A students, and then this student is like beloved by all the teachers and everyone in school, and he's determined to get Teddy to like him because his parents are like determined to get him into a certain college. But the more he sucks up to Teddy, the more Teddy hates him, and the more Teddy hates him, the more the kid hates him, and it's just so fun to watch them go back and forth between one another. The next book that we have is going to be Rule of Wolves. This is the conclusion to the Nikolai duology in the Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. And this book took me by surprise in terms of how good it was. When I read the Shadow and Bone trilogy, I gave each book 2 stars, except for Ruin and Rising. I believe I gave it 2.5 or maybe 3 stars, but I was genuinely unimpressed. I much prefer the Six of Crows duology, but in preparation for the show, I went ahead and read all the books. From the original Shadow and Bone trilogy, I actually really enjoyed Nikolai's character, so I was intrigued enough to go ahead and try to read his duology. I was also very underwhelmed and unimpressed in King of Scars and just unsure with what Leigh Bardugo was doing, and especially like Nina's character, because she does not really interact with any of our main characters, and she's like halfway across the world doing her own thing, and it just felt like all the parts of this book just felt so far away that I was just like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what's happening. And again, I gave the first 3 books 2 stars. Then I gave King of Scars 3 stars. And so when I bought this book, I was not expecting to love it at all. I had really low expectations. Honestly, just being able to give this book 3 stars would have been a win. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by how Leigh Bardugo tied everything together. There are some things that I would really still hark on and complain about. But considering where we were in the original trilogy, and like what happened in Nikolai's duology, I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but basically in this duology, Leigh Bardugo undid everything from the original trilogy. And when I say undid, like she literally undid it all to the point where they actually had to call back up Alina and Mal to be like, hey, remember that problem that you thought you solved? Yeah, you didn't. It's still a thing. And they're just like, well, we tried. It didn't work out clearly. We're gonna retire, and if the world ends, we'll just die, you know what I'm saying, holding hands. Like, she undid it. And I just was like, why is she unraveling so much? Like, there was barely anything to really hold on to from the original trilogy, and to watch her unravel it all in King of Scars, I was truly like almost disgusted, because I'm like, what are you doing? But considering where we were and where we ended in this book, that is magical. It is magical and masterful how she just managed to put all the strayed threads into this freaking book. Now, I will say that although this is Nikolai's duology, he's really like a background character in his own storyline. He's definitely not the focus in either of the 2 books. He does play a part, but if you were thinking about reading the Nikolai duology for the sake of Nikolai himself, I would probably suggest against it, or maybe just go with the audio or like borrow it from your library, because I don't think that you're gonna have a good time. And if you're thinking about reading Rule of Wolves because you want this epic ending for Nikolai, again, I don't know how satisfied you would be. I liked Nikolai, but I also enjoyed other characters as well. I liked Nina from Six of Crows. I also really enjoyed Zoya. So overall, I was satisfied. I feel like objectively this is the best book that she has written in the freaking Grishaverse, and it was a long time coming because I had to suffer through quite a few books to get to here. But again, if you are a fan of Nikolai and you're reading Nikolai's duology for Nikolai, then I apologize to you because you're probably not going to be happy. The next book is one that I read for a vlog, and it was my first time reading from this author, and I had no idea what this book is about, and that is going to be Vicious by B.E. Schwab. I am kind of shocked that I was able to read this with like no context at all. mostly from what I hear about V.E. Schwab is like this Savage song I've seen really reviewed a lot, and A Darker Shade of Magic and Addie LaRue. Like those are definitely the more hyped series by her. And I just managed to start with Vicious, and I guess the people that I follow in the book community did not talk about it as much. So I went into this completely blind. And so if you've read Vicious, imagine what that experience was like for me. I was so surprised by how much I love this book. In this book, we have two characters by the name of Victor and Eli, and they're kind of like science students at this university, and they have to come up with this research project. And their research project is centered around basically unlocking supernatural abilities through adrenaline, or like dying or being close to death. And so they kind of go back and forth attempting to die or like kill one another for the sake of supernatural abilities. And both characters in this book are actually villains, and actually all the characters in this book are villains. And so you follow Victor and Eli in the past when they're best friends and they really can't live without each other, and they're just going back and forth completing suicidal tasks. And then you have them in the future where Eli is like this super Christian and like devout person that's trying to rid the world of evil, and Victor just got out of jail. And you have this sense that Eli is the one who put him there, but you don't know what big blowout happened between these two characters. But they are at each other's neck, and they want each other basically gone, and they'll stop at nothing to accomplish that. And both of them are very vicious, and you kind of just jump back and forth between the past and the future, trying to figure out what happened for them to actually unlock supernatural powers, if they even did unlock supernatural powers, and also in the future where they're like hunting each other down because they are desperate for revenge. I really enjoyed Victor and Eli. Like they had this sense of like passion between one another even in the beginning of the book. Like if you watch my vlog, I definitely thought that there was like some homoerotic vibes between them, because when Victor would talk about his feelings for Eli, they kind of border on the lines of like platonic but also not platonic. It was just like so much jumbled emotions between them. And I think that V.E. Schwab did a great job of explaining like the dynamic of their friendship, even when they were really close and they were best friends, how they kind of competed with each other but also really admired each other. Like they drove one another to be the best, and when one person was ahead of the other, there is a sense of jealousy, but there's also like this ambition pushing them forward. So her ability to write this complex relationship really came through on the page. And so when you get to the future and they're being very vicious and malicious towards one another, I feel like I was really invested and I really understood them. Even though it's hard to understand a relationship like that, I was able to follow along enough, and also understanding how complex their hatred was for one another, and like how desperate they were for revenge, and the stuff that they were willing to do and like stoop to for revenge. And so when it came to the blowout, I was just like, someone is going to lose, and I have no idea who. Both of them are very, very relentless in their quest for victory over the other. The next one is a book that I read in the same vlog, and that is going to be The Last Magician. Now, when I read this book, I read it next to 3 other books. I read The Last Magician, Red Rising, Vicious, and Sky Hunter all together. And for a long time, this one was coming in last, because I mean, Red Rising, if you read it, very action-packed. And then there's Vicious, where we have 2 villains going back and forth against each other for the sake of revenge. And then we have Sky Hunter, which is a YA sci-fi, and I'm a sucker for YA sci-fis. This one's definitely falling behind. It's very intricately plotted, and things don't actually come together until the very end. Because the plot of this one is so like complex, I'm gonna do my best to explain it. This is definitely more of a urban fantasy, because in Manhattan there is this brink, or kind of like this secluded bubble over Manhattan in New York, and everyone who has magical powers that are mages, they have to live in the shadows, and they are not ever allowed to leave the brink, or basically Manhattan, because if they do, they will lose their magic, and some have been known to lose their lives. If they leave, they won't ever be able to come back, and they'll have to live without magic. But however, living in Manhattan is not exactly safe, because they're hunted by this secret order. And the order in Manhattan is actually the people who created the brink. And in the modern day, we have this character by the name of Esther, and she is a thief, and she has this ability to jump time. She has been jumping back and forth to different time periods to steal magical artifacts in an attempt to like break the hold of the brink. But she discovers along the way that the brink is actually tied to their magical powers, and if you got rid of the brink, you would be getting rid of magic in total. And so in 1902, there was this heist pulled off where this secret book that basically explained the brink and how to undo it and get rid of it was stolen by this magician called the Last Magician, and he basically jumped to his death and committed suicide. And so Esther decides to pull off one last heist, which is to go back to 1902, work with the magician and work with the team he used to pull off the heist and steal the book, but actually be the one to get her hands on it to stop the magician from destroying the book, so that in her timeline she can actually figure out how to untether the brink from the ability to use magic. Except when she goes back in time, no one trusts each other. She learns that the magician actually had to work with a team, kind of like a local mob that he actually did not trust at all. The mob didn't trust him. And now they have this stranger, which is Esther, that just popped up out of nowhere, and they don't trust her and she doesn't trust them. And just stuff really takes off from there. And in all the books, so much stuff happens. Like, if you are looking for a YA book that has like the complexity and like the plot of an adult fantasy, especially like an adult high fantasy, definitely this one. There are 3 books out so far, and I will say it takes a lot to keep up with because Esther actually messes up stuff in timelines when she goes back and forth. So you have to keep track of what was actually supposed to happen, and also like what happened because of a mistake that she made. And she's also not the only one with magical abilities, and she's also not the only one after this magical book, because the order actually exists in both timelines. The order exists in her present and also in the past, and she has to make sure that the order doesn't catch on to her, because they're definitely powerful no matter what period she jumps into, and they have the ability to stop her. The ending of this one took me completely by surprise, because for a YA book, this is definitely chunky. This is 500 pages, and the plot does not make sense until the last 20. So imagine reading 480 pages of just random stuff happening with, like, we follow like 8 or 10 different characters. So you're following 8 or 10 different characters for 480 pages, and I would imagine that people would DNF this book because they would probably be like, I don't know what's going on, like what is happening. But the last 20 pages of this book took off like at rocket speed, and stuff just started clicking and clicking, and I was just like, it was one thing after another. I remember being on Zoom with my friends and just saying like, this book is taking me by surprise, and I don't know, like, it's still not doing something for me. And I was describing it to them, and I'm like, it feels like a 3-star. And my friends were just like, I don't know, like, the way you're explaining the book, it definitely sounds like a 5-star read because of what's happening. And I literally said, if Lisa Maxwell does one particular thing with this plot, if this happens in this plot, I'm going to give this book 5 stars. I had to eat crow because she did that and 12 things more, and I was taken aback. This book is definitely worth the payoff that you get to the very end of the book. And I've talked to other people who've read it and like, I don't know anyone who like disliked the book personally. Like I said, I would understand why you would want to DNF it because nothing happens until the end, but everyone that I know who's read this book read it until the end, so it must be interesting enough for us all to see it through to the end. But they all gave it 4 or 5 stars and was just like, yeah, the ending of that book was totally worth everything that happened for the first 450 pages. The next book is a book that has been living rent-free in my head all year, and that is going to be Chosen Ones by Veronica Roth. So 15 years ago in the past, there was this dark force that was taking over the world and kind of creating these like black holes, and people were dying. And there was this lady who put out this prophecy that said that there was going to be this one person that was going to save the world, and the government was desperate to find the chosen one. And so they started looking into kids all around the world who would fit into this prophecy. And so they found 5 potential kids, and they started to train all 5 of them for a future where they might actually have to save the day. And although they end up working hand in hand with each other, kind of like this heroic team, there is actually one person who ended up being the actual chosen one, but the only way that he was able to do that was with the help of the other 4 members of his team. And so where we start this book is 15 years into the future where they've actually already saved the world, and everyone is coping with the reality in different ways. There's one person who actually committed suicide, another person who's dealing with anxiety and PTSD, one suffering from depression, one person has leaned into it completely and they're a social media guru, one is using his influence as like a political platform for social justice, and then we have our main character Sloane, who is very just angry and grumpy that 1, she had to be the chosen one. Why was she destined to save the world? Also 2, why did her parents just give her up like that? So Sloane is just very angry at the world, and she's a very interesting character to read from. And for a long time, I was kind of detached from the story because I wasn't understanding like why Sloane was just so angry and like lashing out at those around her. In the aftermath of the book, I understood a little more that Sloane was battling with her own ways of like coping with the aftermath. She wasn't like addicted to drugs like someone else may have been, or suicidal like someone else has been, but she was holding on to her anger so much to prevent herself from breaking down. And in hindsight, I understood that after the book was over. But the plot of this book is that someone kind of comes and takes them into like this alternate universe, and in the alternate universe they are also battling their own version of a dark one, and they want to use Sloane and her teammates to kind of save their world again. And Sloane and her friends are just like, why do we care? Like, we've already saved the world one time. And they find out that their world is actually tied to this world, and it may even be the same Dark Lord. Maybe they never defeated him, maybe he just went into this alternate universe. But if he were to win in the alternate universe, then he would probably win in their universe too. There's so much that they don't know, so many unanswered questions. What surprised me the most about this book was definitely the ending, because Sloane is very much an anti-hero character, and she's put in like a pivotal point of the story, and she goes from being like this chosen one to possibly being like the antagonist in her storyline. Is very weird, but also very interesting what Veronica Roth did with this plot. But this definitely had one of the most epic endings for a book that I've read this year, and I am constantly checking to get an update for book 2 because I need to know what happened from the ending of this one. Like, the ending of this one is definitely like the biggest cliffhanger that I've read all this year. And The Last Magician had a really huge cliffhanger, but there's 3 books out, so you can jump right into the next one. I'm not used to like reading a book and like really having to wait. I feel like if I know that I'm going to want to compulsively read a series, or a series leaves off on big cliffhangers, I would prefer to wait. However, this one is not really talked about a lot from what I've seen, and I wanted to read from Veronica Roth, and like I really love the cover. I'm a sucker for covers if you cannot tell. And so I just was like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and read it. I did not expect this book to turn out the way that it did, and I wish that I knew someone else who read it, because like I need to discuss this freaking ending. Like, I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but yeah, the ending of this one definitely took me by surprise. The next book that took me completely by surprise is going to be Beast of Prey. I received the arc of this book, I want to say in like March, and I was not really anticipating it like that. Like, I had seen the cover around, but I didn't know what the book was about, and it came like in this box, and it had a huge author's picture, and it was just so much in like the presentation for this book. And when I read the synopsis, this was another one where the synopsis, I was just like, what is even happening? The synopsis did not do this book justice, and it just kept calling to me. And I believe that the book came out in like September, and I literally had 6 months to read it, and I was just like, there's no point. So I was kind of like in a slumpy period, and I was doing sprints with my friend, but I didn't actually want to do any reading. So I just picked this one up because I was just like, yeah, I'll read for the sake of sprints, but I don't want to get invested in a book because I'm kind of like in a slump right now. This book took me completely by surprise with how good it was. In this book, we are following 2 characters by the name of Kofi and Akan. Kofi is an indentured servant at this really exotic zoo, and she has to deal with deadly beasts on a daily basis. And Akan is a part of this brotherhood that basically patrols the kingdom and makes sure that the streets are safe. And there is this wild beast in this jungle that has been haunting people and killing them, and something happens to both Kofi and Akan, and they have to rely on each other to go into this deadly jungle and hunt for the most deadly beast. As they're hunting this beast in the jungle, they start to uncover some really dark secrets about the world that they live in, and the history that they've been told, and just all around a couple of lies that they've been told by their superiors. Because the synopsis of this book tells you that it's basically gonna be 2 kids roaming a jungle, you don't expect much when you're going into it, but the jungle was actually like a smaller aspect of the book than I expected it to be, because we were only in the jungle hunting the beast for a certain period of time. And from the ending of that, and like where this book actually ended, it opened up so many doors for what Ayana can do for the series. And like, there's an entire storyline here, an entire history and plot, and it was just way more interesting than I expected it to be. Again, I thought that the jungle was going to be the main focus, but it was so much more. Like, so much more happens, and I'm excited to follow them on the next journey in the second book, because now the jungle is completely behind them, but their problems are still very much in front of them. The next book is going to be The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina. This was the first book that I actually got from Book of the Month this year, and that was in July. So like, of all the books that they had put out, I was actually not interested in any until I seen this cover. I'll probably do a separate video on like covers that have sucked me in, because I am a sucker for covers, and this one just did something for me. And I read the synopsis a little bit, and it was very, very vague. Like, there's basically this family that has been estranged for a little bit of time, and they get this note from their grandmother basically saying that it's time for her to die and they need to come back home to collect their inheritance. And a lot of her descendants actually think that she's being very dramatic, because who sends out a letter saying, hey, I'm getting ready to die, so you need to come home and get an inheritance? They just literally don't believe that she would be passing. Now, this book is centered around a lot of magical realism, and so there are so many like fantastical elements that exist in the real world, and I feel like the author just tied it in so naturally. Like, a lot of the fantastical elements of this book, don't belong in the story. You know that they don't belong in the real world, but they just fit so perfectly. Like, it just felt so normal. Now, this family does harbor a lot of ill feelings towards their grandmother, because Orquídea is not good with sharing information about her past life, and I believe she's had 4 husbands so far. So their grandmother has lived this full life, but she just will not talk about her past really at all. And they don't know anything about their grandmother, because the house that they were raised in, she's never left. They've never seen their grandmother leave her land or her small house, but she's an older woman who has lived a full life that they can get no information about. And as she's getting ready to die, she basically tells them that she was cursed and like being haunted, and that now it's going to fall to her descendants. It's kind of like this generational curse, and there's nothing she can do to help them. But she also can't explain to them who's chasing them, what the curse even is, or what they can do to break it. And so that definitely makes her descendants much more upset, because they're just like, why can't she just answer one freaking question? This is why we all left home. And I really connected to the family in this book, and I really think that that's what surprised me the most, is that every member of this family literally mirrored a member of my family, and it just felt so freaking realistic. We follow one main character for majority of the book, but you learn about so many family members, and it's definitely multi-generational. And I just feel like the author did such a great job of making each family member totally nuanced, and like bringing them to life on paper for the short amount of time that we do have them on paper. There's one uncle that I literally hated, and I think he probably had 4 or 5 scenes max in the book. Every time we had a family member on page, or just a character on page, it mattered, and she used it to like its fullest potential and its fullest impact. And at one point in the book, her descendants actually take a journey back home to Ecuador, where their grandmother is from, and it's just this sense of like frustration, because not even her family know about her. They found out that the grandmother didn't have really close relationships to anyone in her family. Every time they meet someone who used to know their grandmother in her past life, they all had a very different relationship with her, a very different experience with her. And also the magical realism follows them back home to Ecuador, and it actually takes it up a notch. And I was just really truly invested in this family, and I love what this author did with the idea of generational curses, and how descendants often have to deal with a lot of things that are passed down from the generation before them. Not everything you inherit is actually good, and sometimes you have to make sense of the mess that is left to you. And then the last book that took me completely by surprise this year is going to be Tagana. This is a standalone adult fantasy, and it is definitely not one I would recommend for an introduction to adult fantasy, because it is extremely dense. And when I first started reading this book, I was really truly in a slump, and I think I read like 50 pages, and I had no idea what was happening, and I just put it down, and it took me like 6 months to get back to it. That's how much I was just like over the book. But when I actually finally picked it up and like really started looking into the world and like what to expect with the book, I actually realized that you don't know what's happening in the book until the very end. This is another one like The Last Magician, where everything doesn't actually make sense to the reader until the very end. And once I knew that, I was able to pick it back up and just read it and enjoy the story for what it was. So this book is centered around this very, very powerful wizard. And this wizard was betrayed. And one of the ways he enacted revenge was to curse the homeland of the person who betrayed him. Like basically just killing that person was not enough. And so what they decided to do was curse the land where that person was from. And the land is actually called Tagana. And you actually cannot say it. It's kind of like Stranger Dreaming with the city of Wheat. There's this powerful spell over the world where no one can actually say the name of this country. And the members of this country are actually tired of like being subjugated by this wizard. And they're subject to so much cruelty. And just everyone gets the chance to walk over them just because the wizard has this long-term bone to pick with them. And so there is this uprising and like rebellion in Tagana for the sake of them trying to take back their sovereignty. But overthrowing this wizard who is super powerful is not going to be easy at all, and there's not a bunch of heroes at hand. And actually one of the heroes that was supposed to save this world ended up failing and dying. And I'm a sucker for wizards. I love wizards in a story. Like, you will always get my money. If the book has a wizard or like a sorcerer, you're going to get money out of me. I'm a sucker for it. I'm always going to purchase it. And this book, I was just like, okay, I know not to expect anything. It is definitely a very dense book. There's a lot of words, a lot of pages, a lot of things that are happening. And I ended up switching to the audiobook, and I was just listening to it while I was cleaning my house. And like, okay, the world building was very excessive in this book, and I feel like the author did a really good job of building up these wizards to be very powerful and making them seem almost impossible to defeat. And so when things started popping off in this book and like the plot started connecting, I literally had to like pause the audiobook and go pick it up physically, because I was just like, no, what is happening? Like, I was so bored for like 60% of this book that it was going to be a 1-star, and in the last 40% it jumped from a 1-star to a 5-star read. And that is hard to do with me, because like, come on, like jumping 4 whole stars when I'm reading a book, I had to have been blown away. I did not foresee anything that ended up happening in this book. All of it took me by surprise. It is one of the more dense adult fantasy books I have read. And again, you're gonna be bored for a huge percentage of the story. You actually don't even know what's supposed to be happening for a huge percentage of the story. But the ending of this one, like tying it all together, I was literally mind blown. So yeah, those are 10 books that took me completely by surprise in the year of 2021. And I, for one, am very excited for 2022 because I'm looking forward to the idea of being blown away yet again. If you've made it to the end of this video, please leave me a yellow heart down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time.